So, hello and a very warm welcome to the first live edition of the Student Outcomes podcast. So, thanks very much for being here. So, I'm Sarah, your host for today. I'm co founder and research director at Cosmos, for those that don't know me. And for those that might not know the work of Cosmos, we essentially work with universities on improving student access, recruitment, and outcomes. So today I'm joined by Jon Datta, who is Head of University Access and Digital at the Sutton Trust. And Jon leads the Trust's higher education strategy and also oversees programmes that really champion fair access and social mobility as well. And he's worked previously at the University of Cambridge, leading widening participation. And before that, he was a senior leader and also award-winning teacher in schools across East and North London. So a real wealth of experience there. And he's also currently chair of governors at his local comprehensive school, which is the most improved school in the country for disadvantaged pupils. So yeah, he's doing some really, really fantastic work there. Jon, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. Really pleased to be.
Yeah. Be really, really looking forward to the conversation. And I think just before we get started, just to say to all attendees, please do pop any comments or questions or anything in the chat as we go along. And what we'll do is we'll try to leave some time at the end to go through those, depending on how the conversation goes, Jon. But yeah, let's get started. So I suppose there's currently actually quite a lot of noise, isn't there, about whether university is still worth it? You know, the rhetoric that we're continually seeing in the media and the public-facing outlets. What do you think students think about this when they see this? Do you think that they think it's still worth it? Is it still worth it?
Yeah, so it's the key question, right? And I think we're probably at a point in time where the perception, certainly, of higher education, if not the reality, is that it's undervalued and overstretched. We have never had more data, certainly through our own research, but also plenty of others, on the power of university to change lives. But the narrative around it has become so distorted and so sort of against that, much more focused, I guess, on, is it worth the money, rather than the question that we might ask each other, which is, what would our country look like without the higher education system that we have? We actually have a report out tomorrow called Degrees of Difference, which is an international comparison on higher education and its sort of impact on driving upward mobility. And it still, it finds across the world that higher education is the main driver of upward mobility, and certainly for disadvantaged groups. So in the UK, for example, it accounts for 2/3 of all upward mobility among those from non-graduate families. And graduate from these backgrounds have about 32% chance of reaching top earner status. We'll come back to maybe whether degrees should only be measured on earnings, but it's just below the 36% rate for those with graduate parents. So it's really closed that gap. And if you don't have a degree, or those peers who don't have degrees, it's far above 12% for them. It really does have huge value add. And there's some really interesting work that David Willis did with the Resolution Foundation in King's College London earlier this year, which showed that on average a degree adds about £280,000 for men and £190,000 for women over a lifetime. That's after tax and student loan repayment. So it's about 37% more for graduates than similar non-graduates. And one of the things I think that's worth thinking about is, because more and more students are going to university, and you'd almost expect that the premium to lower, to moderate as participation rises, because that's essentially how markets work, right? But the long-term benefits still persist, and I think that's really important.
Yeah.
The other, sorry, Sarah.
No, it's really interesting to see this real gap between the reality versus perception of what's out there currently in terms of what students are seeing and hearing and absorbing that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think people think that regret is quite common with regards to those who have degrees. Again, the Higher Education Policy Institute looked at this, and only about 6% of graduates say they wish they hadn't gone, and over 80% say their degree was well worth it. The other thing is around finance and tuition fees, where I think lots of people think that universities bank most of the tuition fees, whereas we know that universities operate on a loss for home undergraduates from the UK.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose then, how far is the cost of living crisis kind of shaping decisions about going to university, just thinking about what we've just spoken about in terms of what's out there in the public domain and what people are saying about university. This is obviously a big macro factor, isn't it, that's having an impact.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's massive. So students
Mm.
are, without a doubt, making decisions not just based on their aspirations, but on affordability. I looked at the UCAS produce data every year on sort of what's driving decision making, and they found that financial support is now the second most important factor in university shortlisting, behind only behind choosing a course that's right for that student. And this is up from fourth place back in 2023. And not only that, cost of living support offered by universities has jumped up from what used to sort of be mid-table in terms of importance, from 10th place up to third place, reflecting how, affordability concerns are shaping this decision making. So I would certainly say much more than people realize.
Yeah, and I think also what feeds into it is I've been having some interesting conversations about this with other colleagues as well, and other people in the sector. And I suppose I won't reveal my age, but it was a little bit a little bit of time ago now when I went to university. And I suppose there's times of university that we look back on that you were able to kind of integrate in. I did still have three jobs whilst I was working at university and all of
Yeah,
that, but I was still able to go and experience and
absolutely.
fully embed myself and be on campus. Whereas I think now it's very different. A phrase I heard that I liked, which I will repeat, is students are now living more portfolio lives. So university isn't almost like the center of the world as it used to be before. They have lots of other responsibilities, care responsibilities. The work now, more of them, as we've seen, have jobs. So yeah, I think it, like you say, it kind of feeds into their whole perception and perspective actually going to university, and the cost, and like you say, the finance element as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it really is sort of pretty bad, the situation, really. The maximum maintenance loan only covers about half of what the real living cost is for freshers. And
Okay.
one of the things we've been really focused on, as well as the parental income thresholds for maintenance, they haven't moved since 2008. So what it is currently is £25,000 household earnings, right? And essentially, that's less than one parent earning minimum wage is now deemed too wealthy for their children to get the maximum loan. If we'd index that figure of 25,000, for inflation and earnings, it would be over 40 grand now. So a lot more students would be benefiting from maintenance support. And as you say, being able to enjoy to the fullest, like the university experience. And like, that's really interesting, that phrase you use, because my sort of sense is it is becoming increasingly transactional in nature. Like, I go to
Hmm.
university to get the desired degree, a labor market outcome, rather than the broader benefits of independence and enjoying university, and all of the other benefits, forming networks and all of these really, really important, or massively important, right? Like you said, I went to university and had a lot of fun. Like, I do, when I do, I get worried that's not going to be able to be the case for many students,
Mm.
because, as you say, lots of students are working over 20 hours per week, right? That's what they need to be able to do to make up that gap in the maintenance shortfall. So, but, at the same time, are these jobs even available? Because the two industries that have seen the heaviest job losses, given the current economic climate, is retail and hospitality, right? And they're the ones
Hmm.
that are most amenable, as you can imagine, to students
The
combining with
students.
study. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think now on to, I suppose, topic that everybody has no doubt also that's attending live has been discussing these past couple of weeks, the Post-16 Education and Skills White Paper. Now, how has the White Paper, would you say, reframed access, and what are kind of the implications for that?
Yeah, so I think I'd describe it more as evolution rather than revolution.
Hmm.
And there are lots of really good intents, I think, in the white paper, right? And I don't know if you saw, but the guy who will look after it, the director for fair access, has just been announced on an interim basis
I
following
did see that,
the
yeah.
retirement of John. They're not the retirement, sorry. John won't thank me for saying that. John Blake stepping down, but Chris Millward, yeah, coming in. So I think that there's really good recognition in that. We know that it's not just about access, but it's also really important that students are going through and beyond higher education. And so for example, there's a welcome focus on postgraduate access, which we maybe will come back to, but also, for example, for care experienced students, the automatic extension of the maximum maintenance loan for care leavers, right? Because given that we know that just 12% of that group enter higher education by age 19, sorry, and frankly, these are things that should have happened potentially a long time ago, right? But it's really good to see the government place that focus on it and automate it. The other sort of interesting parts within that, in addition to some of the welcome news on inflation linking tuition fees, and maintenance support uplifting, if not the parental threshold issues that I've sort of already discussed. There's some interesting parts around governance. So talking about taking the risk-based approach. So, what are the specific risks to the institution and the region that the university sits in, and how is the university addressing that through their access and participation plans? But it looks like the regulator will have more powers essentially to let higher performing universities with regards to widening participation get on with it and focus support and scrutiny where needed on those who aren't doing it. And that's, from our perspective at the Sutton Trust, that's our long-standing view that regulation should drive continuous improvement and not necessarily just compliance, right?
So about the quality, I suppose it's been the experience of the student to get in at the end of the day. So that's what matters, right?
Absolutely.
Students.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly, Sarah. Right. And I think one area that I would, have less have sort of more of a potential concern around unintended consequences is on how the maintenance grants coming back being a really good positive intent, but that being tied to certain priority subjects linked to the industrial strategy, which is sort of mostly STEM sort of areas. I do worry about the impact that might have on student choice and on, of course, the arts, humanities, and social sciences.
Yeah.
Given that we know how important they are for critical thinking, for civic life, so that does concern me, and that also looks to be tied to the lifelong learning entitlement that's also outlined in the Post-16 paper too. So I think that we should be careful about the unintended consequences of tying support for those students who need it most to certain subject areas.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that needs to be kind of considered and looked at in rolling it out and implications, like you say. And I suppose there has obviously been this kind of alignment of FE and HE in a way. Interesting. Are we building bridges there or gaps, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I was like talking about V levels, right? And so, ultimately they are trying to fix a real problem. But I think those of us who've been around for a little while would maybe say that we've been trying to fix the same problem for a long time, and we've already been through sort of BTECs and other forms of technical qualifications. But it is really important that we move towards parity of esteem for rigorous technical routes. I think ultimately, if they get V levels right, they design them well, they should open routes into both skilled employment and higher education. But the perpetual worry with this argument is creating a two-tier system, vocational for some, academic for others. And I do think that what's really interesting about V levels is this focus on permeability, so being able to sort of mix and move between routes without dead ends, and on universities engaging really seriously with the students and the curriculum arriving from the different pathways. So I'm all for it if the flexibility widens choice and doesn't narrow it.
Yeah. And I suppose then thinking practically about it, what do you think the priorities are for universities then in response to this? What are the key, I don't know, top one or two things at least that you think they should be focusing on now?
Yeah, so I think maybe not necessarily universities themselves, but it's about having admissions processes set up so that they're ready in good time to be able to implement like entry requirements for B levels. We saw this kind of this sort of slower uptake for T levels and recognition of T levels. And ultimately, that's just going to be a perpetual cycle then of students not being able to, necessarily want to go down those roads if they don't think they're going to be able to get into the institutions they'd like to off the back of them in the short term. Um, but I think anything around where it's really tricky with when you start going into sort of flexible pathways. But it feels really really important. Like the lifelong learning entitlement that I just briefly touched on could be total game changer, right? And so just for those who aren't aware, the LLE, the lifelong learning entitlement, gives people the equivalent of 4 years funding to use for higher or further education at any point in their lives. So rather than committing to a full 3-year degree, they could take shorter modules, bank credits, return study later, or only study up to the level that they need to go into the profession that they'd like to. And so that sort of flexibility is a good thing, and I think
Mm,
it could really benefit certain groups of students. So I'm thinking about those with caring responsibilities, adult learners, and maybe even those in some certain parts of the country. Being able to bank credit and pause and return makes a lot of sense, but I just have some hesitancy because I know that this has faltered in England in the past, and only about less than 2% of students switch provider within a year. Ultimately,
yes.
from
Yeah.
a university standpoint, go back to your question, like I don't think the infrastructure incentives and standardization are there yet.
Right.
And you can probably imagine universities, given current financial pressures, they're not going to be rushing to models that might stratify their income unless
Indeed.
unless they're properly funded, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All good points, definitely. And I suppose thinking about then, young people really. Obviously you guys do a lot of research at the Sutton Trust. When you speak to young people, what would you say kind of tips the decision for them on whether to go to university or not? What are the tipping things? Obviously, we've referenced some of them a little bit earlier on in the conversation.
Yeah, so I didn't actually say, what we do at the Sutton Trust, which is probably
Oh yeah,
probably
might be
a
a good idea.
helpful place
Yeah.
to start, right? So we care about social mobility, and that's improving, particularly around improving young people's life chances, and we do that in a number of ways. So we do research, but we also run programs that specifically focus on allowing students to access highly selective institutions, and also apprenticeships as well, through whichever different pathways is right for that individual. And in terms of what we see, through these programs, frankly, I see this day in, day out, that it's not necessarily one big decision, but it's hundreds of little moments, right? And I think there's probably three broad themes in this current sort of part in this current at this current time that we're seeing that are really shaping these decisions of whether or not to go or to not to go to university, or indeed, through other routes. And that's probably confidence. um Many people don't, many people might not think that people like them go to universities like that. You've then got belonging, about whether they'll actually fit in socially and financially, as we've touched on, but also practically, like as we've talked about, the burden, the perception of debt burden, and not seeing that the student loan actually more like a graduate contribution than a debt, and it kind of gets lost. And this nuance gets lost for families who don't have experience of higher education themselves, right? Um, and
Mhm.
the other thing I think is the crucial distinction between aspiration and expectation. So we know that many young people aspire to go to university, but their
Yeah.
expectation of getting there and getting through university is much lower. So
Mm,
there's some interesting research. I think it's by UCL, where levels of aspiration to go to university are broadly similar across all socioeconomic groups, and it's about 50% in the most deprived quintile aspire to go to higher education. But turning that into expectation is totally different. So, it's like, yes, I want to own my own business, but I don't think I'm ever actually going to manage it, right? And so how we move towards expectation is that we need to create believable pathways for these students, concrete steps, introduce them to relatable role models, and then also programs like ours that show them how to go through each next step and how it's broken down and that it's achievable. And that's exactly what we try and do in our programs. And I do worry about, we've done a report on careers guidance in schools, and the system is incredibly uneven. And one of the things we saw out of that was that 38% of students in state schools had no participation in careers activities, and it was about
yeah.
half of that in private schools. And so it's patchy. We often start too late in the student life cycle. We start talking. Students might only be aware of like the options that they could go into when they're in year 12, year 13. And the earlier we can get to students, the more sustained and progressive we can build up the information and guidance, as very good outreach programs do, the more likely we are to change the dial.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what you said like completely relates and echoes in terms of the research that we've done. We've done a lot of research in this area. I'd say today we've conducted research of well over 100,000 disadvantaged students. Maybe not the same figures as you guys, but yeah, a lot of what you're saying kind of rings true. So a big study that we did for FE students, you know this one well, 35,000 students. But actually interesting what you're saying about aspiration versus the expectation. So in that, we saw one group of students, which was around 27%. That were very confident, and the rest, to varying degrees, weren't as kind of confident in terms of actually getting there. So obviously, they have the aspiration, but like you say, it's that gap that needs plugging in terms of the you know, them actually being able to achieve what it is that they want to achieve. Okay, so I
Yeah.
think in terms of interventions then, so obviously we spoke a lot about that in interventions, and you know, the fact that there are these gaps, but I suppose which ones have you seen that reliably do shift that mindset, those attitudes and the aspirations for students? Which ones do
Well,
that reliably?
seen many over the years, right? And but
Yeah.
I'll focus on the ones we deliver
Mhm.
ourselves at the Sutton Trust, you know, and the students do need, as I said, repeated touch points and not one-off assemblies. And our data backs that up because participants in our programs, and I'm specifically sort of talking about our Sutton Trust summer schools, which are in partnership with 13 highly selective institutions, and also our pathways programs, which are sort of very intensive 18-month program that's focused specifically on certain careers, so you know, like law, banking and finance, that sort of thing. But when we do the evaluation on this, they're twice as likely to apply to and receive offers from highly selective institutions, and that's even if you control for the attainment levels. um, I should also flag that we have a program that supports some of the most extraordinary students I've ever come across, which is the Sutton Trust Fulbright US program. So we support students to access Ivy League and highly prestigious colleges
Wow.
in the US, and about almost 1 in 3 students access, and I mean fully funded scholarships at prestigious US
Wow.
colleges, and they're not competing just with other UK students; they're competing with the whole world, you know, who are going for these scholarships. So it's amounted to about $200 million in financial aid over the course of running
Wow.
the program. So pretty extraordinary, right? But none of this happens, you know, by magic. It's really hard work. It's mentoring. It's repeated touch points. They need to feel part of a network that lasts into the long term. And the other component that I think is really important in the work we do is that we use digital wraparound, but particularly around, you know, our summer schools and our pathways. So we're building up, as we've spoken about with regards to, you know, the work that you just described with the segmentation. We're building up personalized pathways that join up
Mhm.
knowledge and skills development, mentoring, university and apprenticeship discovery, and it even includes things like, you know, direct attainment raising like tuition support. And as you can imagine, we've been very interested in the development of AI and its potential use in supporting students from underserved backgrounds. And so we've just started looking at AI interview support for those courses that require interviews. So, you know, medicine and Oxbridge courses, for example. But
Mhm.
also the massive benefit we've seen of Sutton Trust Online is that we can meet students where they already are, and they can take what they
Mm.
need, you know, from the digital platform. And you can imagine, you know, they're often on their phones late at night, you know, like looking this stuff up, right? And we're able to do that, and it gives them much more agency over the journey by having the digital support around our in-person provision.
Yeah, I like that idea, kind of almost, and I suppose a lot of the people live here today will know that hard work, and the fact that you do have to be really consistent, and you know, like you say, it is a lot of kind of repeated efforts, and yeah, I think in terms of having those multiple approaches and touch points with students, as we've seen in the data, that does really have a significant impact on student outcomes. And I think one of the key things, as we've talked about quite a lot, Jon, is this idea that you know, the static demographic data, so postcode isn't a proxy for student need. It is really about looking at that mindset. I know that Matthew Horton as well. I did see you registered. I don't know if he's here today. He talks a lot about that as well. Just about we need to, like you say, meet students where they're at. What are they thinking? You know, how are they feeling
Yeah,
themselves? What is their perception of higher education, as we spoke about? All of these things matter in terms of
absolutely.
where students are, giving them the support that they need, and what also are their knowledge gaps. Uh, we need to understand that on a granular level, really.
Absolutely, yeah, and this all contributes to, like, belonging and confidence. Like,
Yeah,
it's quite easy to measure ultimate outcomes, but it's really
yeah.
important that we focus in on, as you've just been saying, how do they feel like they belong? Do they feel confident in making that step? But one
Mhm.
of the other programs that we're involved with on both with a pilot cohort ourselves, but also nationally with our charity partner Causeway Education, is on
Mm.
undermatch. So undermatch is specifically around students who have an attainment profile that would suggest they should be, applying to a course at that sort of, the level that you would expect, right, for that grade profile, but they're undershooting that, right? So they're applying to less, if you like, less competitive courses than what their attainment profiles would suggest. And it's absolutely fascinating, and it's particularly pronounced, as you might imagine, for underserved students,
Mm.
but also for
Mhm.
females as well, in particular.
Yeah,
And so we're trying to get
see
into the
that.
drivers of, why is that? And a bunch of this is around, the expectation aspiration gap, but we're doing some really concrete interventions about choices at the right time. Some recent research on this from some colleagues at UCL has shown that private school students essentially make the majority of their applications aspirational choices. So just whatever their grade profile is, they'll aim, like, almost all of their UCAS courses will aim quite high. Whereas for state school students, it's like they go for one choice, which they think is pretty, maybe risky and above what they perceive they might be able to, their predicted grades suggest, or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And the rest of them are kind of safe choices. And so we're trying to do some work around, like, when do we intervene at the right times to make them make ambitious choices that actually
Mm.
ultimately are the right fit for those students once they've had the information and guidance, got the attainment, and all of the factors that feed into it to ultimate success.
And something as well that I'll just move on to now that I know you advocate for, but around kind of contextual offers. So, what's the case for contextual offers today? And I suppose what does good practice look like in that space?
Yeah, so I think this gets to the sort of core of what the Sutton Trust exists for, right? Which is essentially that opportunity is not evenly spread around this country, and
Indeed.
talent is, right. And so a
Mm.
young person's socioeconomic background, ultimately, including things like the income level of their family, their parents' educational qualifications, family wealth, but all sorts of other factors. Whether you're a carer, whether you've got experience with the care system, almost, if whether you're disabled, to come in disabled student, all of these are contextual factors that are absolutely critical in determining, where they're at that point in time. And contextual admissions are so important for me because it's one of the few levers we have to make entry genuinely fair. Like,
Mm.
I think, I think what really contextual admissions are about is recognizing that grades don't tell the whole story, that they reflect attainment as well as
Mhm.
advantage. If you looked at a student who, say, got ABB in a school where almost no one had gone to university, or, has been one in three children in this country living in poverty right now,
Yeah.
I think you could make a pretty strong argument that they would have demonstrated at least as much potential as someone, say, with three A's at a high performing independent school who'd been given, lots of additional support, for example. And actually, it
Mhm.
was really, really good to see Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer last night saying that a child should never be penalised because their parents don't have very much money with regards to the two child benefit cap. But I think contextual admissions is almost, like you'd make the same argument around that, right? Um,
Yeah.
the other reason I'm such a proponent of contextual admissions, and in particular contextual offer making, is really what I'm describing. So making offers that are slightly lower than what would be the typical sort of entry profile for students, is that we've seen at lots of different universities that students who are admitted on contextual offers and often perform just as well, if not better, than their peers once they're at university. Now, of course, they may need some support. We shouldn't assume that they need additional support, but they may need it.
Indeed.
They may need that support. But my belief with all of this is that ultimately we should not be operating on a deficit model. It's not the students who should change. It's the system that should change, right?
Exactly.
To recognize that
Yeah.
potential. So for me, that's not a deficit model, that's an equity model. And that's really important to me. And at the Sutton Trust, we've actually got, so because the other part of this is, what on earth are the options for contextual
Indeed, I
like
imagine
offers,
there's
right?
quite a
Like,
few. Yeah.
It's like, I mean, it's genuinely, incredibly inconsistent. So, and it's really, there's a real lack of transparency at the moment around what's available to students, right? And how can, so like I've looked at, I'm not going to name names, but I've looked at certain contextual offer web pages of certain universities, and I don't understand, what would be needed to be able to make the decision on, and what the sort of eligibility criteria or the profile of sort of student I would need to be eligible. And if I can't understand, then what chance does a 17-year-old? I embed myself in this. So one of the things we sort of done to like over the last couple of years is we developed a tool. So it essentially shows all of the different universities who offer contextual offers, and it shows you what are the eligibility criteria they use. Where can you find out more information? And that's what we need to get to for me, is sector consistency on core principles, but also respecting institutional autonomy. And in our tool, when I looked at this, last time, there was at least 15, 16, 17 different measures of eligibility. Some universities use 2, some universities use 12. So I guess what I want to get to is some form of standardization and recognition of what the best eligibility criteria are. Maybe this is formed sort of like a basket of measures. From a basket of measures, you might determine the right ones that are useful for your context and your institutional context. But we need some more consistency, and we need some more transparency, so that students, their supporters, and their teachers are able to, so they don't need a PhD to decode who qualifies and why, right?
Indeed, yeah. Thanks, John, for that. I think you're absolutely right on all points. I think awareness as well, like you say, I don't think students are necessarily kind of aware of that. In all the research that we've done, it's never kind of necessarily really come up as something that students are aware of as an option. And then, like say, even if students do get to it, they need to be able to understand what it is that they're looking at and what will make them
Absolutely.
eligible. So I know you're talking about this more at a
ju-
panel next week,
Yeah.
at Universities UK.
Right, I should flag that we are working on a project exactly on the basis of what we've just discussed with Universities UK and UCAS, to try to come to some conclusions on what good looks like in this space.
Brilliant. So we'll share kind of details. Anything we've mentioned here, projects, reports, things like that. We'll share all the links in the follow-up email after the event today. If you're finding this conversation valuable and want more insights just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Educator newsletter. And it's where we share practical tools, interviews with sector leaders, and deep dives into the pressing issues facing and shaping education today. So it's completely free, and it's designed for educators like you who want to make that real impact. You can find the link to sign up in the show notes, or head over to cosmosltd.uk. And that's Cosmos, COSMOS Ltd.uk. And if you head over there, you can fill in the pop-up box for the newsletter. Don't miss out. So coming on to a recent report that you've published, Sutton Trust has published around regional gaps. So the Opportunity Index report, and this highlights some really persistent regional gaps. I also know that NEAN have done some work in this area and also published some reports in this area. What's driving them, and what can universities kind of do differently? They just seem to be, like saying, very, very kind of persistent.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. So also, I mentioned when we just on the white paper, they also announced a task and finish group. So, and one of the big focuses is around regional variation for that group. Our CEO Nick is sitting on that, but so is Graham Atherton at Neon, as you mentioned, who's interested in this. So what we did with the Opportunity Index is we looked at how socioeconomic background, geography, and opportunity interact. And we looked at data at parliamentary, constituency, and regional level in England. And so this includes things like educational attainment to opportunities in higher education and employment. And it compared outcomes of young people across the country with a particular focus on the chances of social mobility for young people from lower income homes. And what we found there is that where you grow up still shapes your journey hugely, much more than it should. And in some cold spot areas, I don't really like that term in terms of like the sort of framing of it as those areas are the fault and not the system again. But young people, are 10 times less likely to progress to higher education in some of these regions than in the most advantaged regions, many of which, as you might imagine, are in London. And separately, government data shows in inner London that, over half of students who are eligible for free school meals progress to HE by age 19 in inner London, and in the southwest it's just 19%, right? So just to sort of like just to reiterate that point, in the free school meal rate in inner London is broadly in line with the national rate for all students. That's how extraordinary London overperforms, compared to everywhere else. And even more remarkable is I was looking at some PISA data, which is like international comparative data, and disadvantaged children in England score about 30 points higher on average than disadvantaged children in Wales. This is another remarkable stat that I saw this morning. I have to shout out my colleague Adam for pointing me towards this earlier. The performance of the disadvantaged children in England is either above or similar to the average for all children in Wales, and that is all of these sort of those sort of statistics. They're not just about attainment, right? That is about infrastructure. That is about the distance you have to travel. That is about transport costs. That is about local government, weaker school FEHE networks, lower social capital. There is more to this. Thanks to this variation, in place-based access. There just has to be more to it. And it was actually really pleasing to see the OFS again in the white paper talking about regional access partnerships. And these could make a real difference if you pull together data, funding and delivery, stop duplicating effort, which has, been happening in the sector for I think a long time. That's got to be the direction we use for. And schools, universities, employers, local government, charities need to act together if we're serious about breaking the geography trap, if you like. I guess you could say that, schools fulfill the function of culture initially, attainment, early advice, universities on the work on outreach, contextual admissions, sustained programs that we discussed, employers play their part, work experience, apprenticeships, and then you've got local authority on those areas that are sort of more infrastructure based, transport, housing, convening power. And then you've also got, charities who know their local region inside out and are able to sort of, I guess, sort of like innovation in the particular areas that are specific to that place. Sorry, Sarah. Yeah, I'm talking too much, aren't I?
You're good. You've got lots of knowledge, so we want to hear it. I was just kind of interested in the collaborative point that you mentioned. So I will shout out Neon again. I think I did see Martin in the audience. So hi Martin, if you're here. I chaired a panel at the one of their recent events, and that was all around kind of collaboration. And again, it was looking at regionally these disparities, how can we work together to help to kind of close these gaps? And I think your point around actually not duplicating effort it is a fair one in terms of actually how can we really kind of move the dial on this, because it's something that's been so persistent. What, like I say, it's infrastructure, isn't it? It's these big things, seismic things that actually will only move if institutions, let's say local authorities, all start kind of working together and looking at the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Ultimately, we need to take a sort of ecosystem approach to this. I'm involved with a project in the southwest, which has some of the worst, progression. I mentioned, the comparison between inner London and the southwest in terms of free school meal progression, and that's exactly the way they've approached this. So it's via an organisation called the Colleton Foundation, and we have brought together all of these different actors in the region to try to do something about it. And even then, with all the best intentions and all the right people in the right place, there are still very practical issues around transportation, for example, that are localized, that are much more of an issue in certain places than others. And that's why it's really, you've seen this sort of increase in commuter students, right? Students who choose to stay at home and travel to university. And I think that we should be looking at that more closely as that becomes more prevalent, and making sure that the experience of those students is at least as good, as for other students. And that goes into all sorts of areas, like like timetabling, for example, and the sense of belonging, and what does it mean to experience university from home, like you talked about your experience at university. That's fundamentally different to someone who stays at home and travels in.
Indeed. Okay, so I think moving on to now another kind of specific group cohort that are getting a lot of attention at the moment. Boys from working class backgrounds, essentially, so boys on free school meals. Again, we see that lag persistently in terms of their outcomes. And I know that obviously Alex Blower, known well, he's been on the podcast, and his work in Boys Impact. He's doing, such tremendous, great work in this space. But I suppose from your perspective, what approaches have you seen that really do reach and motivate this cohort?
Yeah. Big fan of Alex as well. I've worked with him for some time. And the progression rates are shocking for white British students at free school male eligible males. 13.8% it was the last government data showed. Interestingly, again, just with a killer stat there, is that GCSE pass rates of white free school male boys is less than half the rate of non-white, non-free school male girls. That again just tells you something's wrong. These children don't lack ability. They're children who've been alienated by a system that just isn't seeing them, and how have we got to a place where how have we got to a place where that's the case? It just can't be explained by innate need alone. So I should also say, I think a really important point in all this as well is that the rates for white working class girls are not much better. And they get even further left behind in this debate. And there's been very little scrutiny on that group, but they are pretty horrendous, right? And there are other outcomes that also are strikingly worse for these groups of students, and that's that their attendance is worse. They're more likely to be excluded. They make less progress, and so and that's like in sharp comparison to what's going right for children whose parents immigrated to Britain, right? So again, going back to PISA data, essentially high attaining children in England were second. The most high attaining group were were second generation immigrants, and we were the only developed country where that was the case. And it's also we've talked a lot about the London effect, or if you like place-based effect, but it's also how the famous London effect of school improvement largely disappears when you control for ethnicity. So this issue with white working class holds even in London.
I see, even in London. Yeah.
And so my sort of sense here is like it's about culture. It's about are our systems. This is not necessarily a Sutton Trust view, and maybe just a question like to put out there. It's like have we just created institutions that are very good at producing middle class cultural fluency, and ultimately if you've got a whole demographic of students who don't recognize themselves in that culture, you can imagine that things like school feel like an exercise in becoming not like you. And that for me is where you get this gap between understanding what it's like for those students, and maybe there's just like they lack the dignity and relevance that they deserve. So what works was your question, Sarah. I mean, this, as you said, this has been a sort of generational, a very difficult, intractable issue, but high expectations, strong relationships, visible role models, practical routes, all of the work that Alex Blower and others are doing is focused on those areas, right? And another component of this that I'm a huge advocate for is the importance of parental engagement and buy-in. It's absolutely critical. So the Brilliant Club operate the parent power model, which I was involved in the early stages and set up three of the chapters. And I mentioned that project in the Southwest, whereby we created a parental engagement framework there. And it is all about relational approaches. And what I mean by that is that we're not doing to these groups, we're working with them to understand what are the real barriers that they're facing. We ask them questions like why are you angry? What makes you angry? And we build up from there and really try to and to do something about it. And ultimately, I think if these groups, in particular white working class boys and girls, are able to emulate people who look like them and come from them in their own communities, that's what makes the difference. Making these groups visible to skilled work and to university, not one or the other, to both. And that's really important. And that's actually something you very kindly pointed out Coleridge's increase in disadvantage attainment to be the most improved in the country, which I'm very proud of. But all the credit should go to the staff team on the ground, I should say. But it was all focused on adult student relationships, absolute high expectations, culture of belonging. That's how it wasn't magic. It was structure, culture, belief. Turning school into a place that was for those students just as much as it was for anyone else. And so it's not just about tutoring and academic attainment interventions. belonging, relevance, trusted relationships. And when I do see that in action, I'm reminded again that this isn't about fixing the children. It's about fixing the systems that keep telling them that they're the problem.
I like that. I like that line. Yeah, absolutely. It's about fixing the system, not the children, and having that empathy as well in terms of
Absolutely.
understanding their circumstances, what's happened. Like you say, asking them, if they're angry, why they're angry. So not thinking actually what's wrong with this child, actually what has happened to this
Yeah.
child, what's their experience, what's their perception. So yeah, agree with all of that.
You'd
so,
also be the other part with with regards to deficit. Sorry, you've got me on a
no,
roll.
yeah, I've got a few more questions, but go on, John, you go
Yeah.
for it.
It's also, I think what we should also be thinking about there is what are the strengths that these students have that others don't, and so if you come from certain circumstances or indeed, hardship, you will have developed some incredibly important skills that are extremely beneficial ultimately to universities, to the workplace in due course, that others just simply won't have through virtue of not having experience of those hardships or, through those circumstances. So how do we operate in a strengths-based model and not a deficit model? I think has to be at the crux of lots of this.
Completely agree with that. I'm thinking, looking at time, I want to leave, I've seen some things popping up in the chat, so I want to leave enough time at the end just to kind of go through them. So just on a couple of questions. One you mentioned earlier actually was PG access and the fact that it needs to kind of feature more prominently in access and participation plans. So that's something that's spoken about a lot, is it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really important, firstly, and I
Yeah.
was really, really glad to see a focus on it. Ultimately, postgraduate studies increasingly the gatekeeper to the sort of like top professions, if you like, traditionally top professions, professional careers. And if you think about the inequalities we tackle at undergraduate level, they re-emerge there, at postgraduate with a vengeance, frankly. We produced a report called Elitist Britain earlier in the year. You might have seen it, yeah. 36% of those essentially in Britain's top roles, attended private schools, despite making up 7% of the population. And that sort of ultimate overrepresentation underlines how much of the inequality at the top comes from early educational privilege. And when we looked at postgraduate access ourselves, we have a report called Inequality in the Highest Degree. Yeah, no, great name. Found that graduates from less privileged backgrounds are far less likely to progress to postgraduate study, even when, again, you control for grades and even when they attend similar universities. So we found barriers like limited financial support and high fees. Indeed, like postgraduate tuition fees can often exceed the maximum loan. So, that might leave very talented people, graduates, priced out. Maintenance support is virtually non-existent. And there's a lack of transparency in admissions again at that stage. And then a really key part that came out of our report, was this much weaker access to networks and supervisors than more privileged students had.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if we care about representation in academia, in things like law, in professions like law and policy, we need to start treating postgraduate access as part of the same journey as undergraduate access. So putting it into APPs is a good start.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything you said there. And I suppose I'm thinking about that journey then, going on to thinking about employability. A conversation that we had just before coming on was around AI. Obviously, everybody's talking about it, aren't they? That's reshaping work, learning, our world as we know it. How should universities prepare graduates for the future labour market, or can they? The rate that it's changing at the moment.
I mean, I feel like that's a whole other podcast episode.
That's a whole other podcast.
Probably not one for top line, yeah. I'm certain there are more better experts in this field than I am. But I think my sense here is that AI is changing tasks, but maybe not necessarily eliminating the need for high level skills. So critical thinking, adaptability, ethical judgment, communication. Frankly, they've never mattered more than in the age of AI. And I think the real risk is that there'll be fewer, not that there'll be fewer graduate jobs, but that maybe that universities haven't adapted to embedding AI literacy, transferable skills, these important transferable skills into all of their disciplines. And we've already, I mentioned the AI interview work that we do through Sutton Trust Online. So we've already started exploring, how AI can be beneficial earlier on in that pipeline. And I think it will allow personalization in a way that hasn't historically been possible. We're already seeing it shape, assessment in schools, for example, but it also helps students map their strengths. I think AI will be really good at, helping to map strengths against emerging academic and labour market needs, and being able to show that. So I think, regardless of how AI ultimately shapes and how we harness it, and how we and I think we need to see it as an opportunity, as in addition to being wary of the risks that come alongside it, is that I think helping young people see that higher education is still the best foundation for an uncertain future. But I think we'll see. I think we'll see that ultimately the world continues to evolve. With AI, and our students are very well equipped. We are very well equipped to have the skill set to move with it and not past it.
Lovely. Great answer. Thanks, John. So I'll just ask one last question, then we'll go into the comments. And so just one more question. Last question from me, John, is one development idea giving you hope at the moment? So kind of a positive one to finish the question on, because we've talked a lot about obviously some of the disparities, and some of the persistent gaps and all of that sort of stuff. But what's giving you hope at the moment?
Yeah, nice to end on a positive note. For sure. And
yeah.
I remain extremely positive, and frankly, the big reason for that is just key. If you listen to young people, you can't help but be filled with optimism and hope, because every time I speak to a student on one of our programs, I'm reminded of how extraordinary they are. Despite all of the challenges that they might go through, they are amazing. They are ambitious, resilient, and grounded. And as we've been saying throughout this whole sort of episode, our job is to make sure the system deserves it.
Yeah, I like that reframing. Definitely. Thank you, John. So let's go to the chat. I've seen a few comments popping up. We've got a few in here. Right, we've got Martin. So hi, Martin. So Martin said, we know that many higher education providers are experiencing cuts that are directly impacting upon widening access activities. Examples include whole teams being put at risk of redundancy. How should the sector respond to this? So yeah, I suppose it's the very real kind of crunch in terms of, resources and finances to kind of fund obviously this work in universities right now.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and it's a tricky one. So I think one thing we didn't talk about, which has been a real focus, of the access and participation plans and the sector of late, has been evidence, right? And so I think what we should be doing is building on the excellent work that Omar Khan and his team at TASO have been doing on identifying, value for money, what's effective, what's driving impact, and continuing to take that very seriously. And at the same time, I think it's really important that we emphasize the importance of this work, not just to university and their outcomes, but to the wider economy, and to society at large, across all of the institution, right? So one of the really important parts of where one of the most positive, I think, areas of where this sector's gone in recent times is that we've stopped thinking about social mobility and access and participation success being just the job of the widening participation teams, and that it's really important that we take a whole provider approach. Widening participation is everyone's business. It's not just the WE team's business, and that affects how we deliver the curriculum. It affects all of the transition work we've discussed, and making sure that students feel comfortable going into this. But yeah, ring fencing funding, identifying what works, and adapting to the climate we find ourselves in. And hopefully, of course, we will see an upturn in circumstances economically in the future, and be able to dedicate more, ultimately, more financial resource to this area.
Indeed. And I should say evidence definitely counts in this area. Okay, so next one, Ellen. She's wondering what you think, John, about whether university admissions processes should take school type into account more. And interesting. So at Pre-16, not just the UCAS Apply Centre. So working at a state sixth form college, I have a feeling students might be playing the system, and part of their decision to move from the private to state sector to benefit from applicant support, contextual admissions, etc., thus potentially pushing out other students.
Yeah, so I think really this question's around sort of eligibility for maybe programs, or for contextualized admissions. So we've done a lot of work on measuring disadvantage. What I think is really important there is, so we do look at not necessarily just the type of college or school that students have attended to, but what the rates of progression were for that
Mhm.
college over time. So we get a really good sense by triangulating the type of institution and what their success rates or what their, like average attainment rates are, but also combining that with individual level data, free school meals, whether they've got experience in the care system, and maybe then indeed, like an area-based measure like IMD or ACORN that are good correlators in for the most part in terms of measuring low socioeconomic status. If you triangulate across all of those measures, I think it's actually quite difficult for a student to sort of like play the system, because you're really getting to quite a deep individual level of data. You're getting really quite detailed triangulation data. I think we should be sympathetic in some cases to some of the work that independent schools are doing with regards to scholarships and bursaries, particularly around care experience students, who they often target, and that frankly we should celebrate the fact that they're giving care experience students lots of support when they need it as well.
Great, thanks for the answer, John. Again, agree with those points. I think, but one last question. Fatola, hi. Fatola works in evaluation for Uni Connect partnerships, and basically they've been thinking a lot about how post-16 policy changes filter down to local practice. From an evaluation perspective, how do we strike the right balance between quantitative outcomes and the lived experiences that really bring fair access work to life? So the quant versus qual kind of debate. And linked to that, how can wider participation teams make better use of local data to anticipate the effects of these reforms rather than responding only once participation gaps start to widen? So sorry, it's two questions in there.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah.
I'll try and so I think so we use a combination of both. So we I think it's really important that you're able to get real student qualitative data on the ground, because you often get a really clear understanding of, like, especially iterative improvement to programs from student voice. So we use that really carefully. We listen really carefully. We identify themes and trends and just practical improvements, I think. But we should absolutely be tracking longitudinal data and looking towards randomized controlled trials, or at least control groups wherever possible, to be able to demonstrate impact. So I think it's always going to be both. And I think it's not always the case, and also there are, I'm sure if you're working in evaluation yourself, you're probably far, I rely on my colleague Adam, who I mentioned earlier, to put me straight on some of the more technical details of evaluation. But I think there'll always be a need for both, for different purposes. I think the second was around local data, was it? And sort of local.
Yeah. The second one was, how can widening participation teams make better use of local data to anticipate the effects of these reforms rather than being reactive, essentially?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what local data in particular they're referring to, but I think we should be able to use historical data, over time, to be able to anticipate what the needs might be going forward. We saw, for example, like we know, for example, that COVID had a huge impact in an unfathomable amount of ways on the impact of students and their success rate. And we're still seeing those cohorts come through, and we will continue to see the effects of that effect of COVID on cohorts. I think, even now that we're going into sort of younger year groups, but I think we'll still see this coming through. So what can we learn from having looked at evaluation over a long time? We've been running the summer years 30 years in 2027. It would have been 30 years. We're really interested actually in, like, what have we learned across 3 decades, of delivering summer schools, and how can that contribute to the whole wider sector benefiting from implementing them as effectively as possible.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, looking at previous data to try and help to figure out what's coming next. And like you say, COVID, we've definitely seen that as well, still kind of filtering through and having an impact on students. Okay, so I think we are at time now. I think we've done pretty well there. We've got through a lot, haven't we, John? Yeah, so thank you so much for your time, your insights, your wisdom, your knowledge, all the stats that you're able to kind of just come out with off the top of your head. I'm amazed at that. So yeah, really appreciate you being here. And thanks to everyone who's joined us live, and thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this conversation, We've also got actually a newsletter you can subscribe to stay updated on some of the upcoming events, new podcast episodes, and other thought pieces that we've got going on. Got some really interesting things coming up in the next 6 months or so. And we'll also follow up with an email containing the replay of today's session if you missed anything, and links to all of the reports and resources Jon mentioned. So thanks again for being here, everybody, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.